Finally, we have an interesting caveat as well with Protestant missionaries. Most people don't study the Middle East during the Civil War because, frankly, we didn't really have a diplomatic presence outside of major cities like Constantinople, Tangier, Cairo. We probably only had a few hundred statesmen in the Middle East. But what we did have is hundreds of Protestant Christian missionaries. And Michael Oren makes the point that the overwhelming majority of these missionaries were allied to the Union because of their abolitionist sympathies. So we have this kind of de facto diplomatic core of these missionaries influencing local populations with American civil religion. And so in addition to this diplomatic presence, we have these missionaries. And so we already have this ideological influence of this discourse I mentioned. So we've seen early U.S. encounters with the Middle East. I think they're significant. They're more than just entertaining stories, even though they are certainly that. We've seen U.S. encounters with the Middle East during the war, seemingly obscure on the surface, but more important because they're tied diplomatically to the great powers, our biggest concerns, the French and the British. Now we need to look at how these characteristically change after the war. And I make the argument that the conclusion of the Civil War saw a consolidation of power, ideologically, politically, and economically. And this can be contentious, so I want to be modest with my argument, and I want to state it in humble claims and stick to some basic facts, and not really elaborate. But the first is, ideologically, you have the defeat of slave labor and the triumph of a free labor ideology. Right. The chief document of this is, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation, but also the Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln brilliantly states in a few paragraphs that there's going to be a new birth of freedom. And he was referring specifically, he says, a new birth of freedom for the United States. But if we look to Lincoln's understanding of the Declaration, we can understand that this was broader than just the United States. And Gary Wells makes a great point of this in the introduction to his book on the Declaration. And he quotes Lincoln. Lincoln says that the Declaration gave liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future things. It was that which gave promise that in due time the weights would be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. And so Wills, as well as some other Lincoln scholars, make the argument that Lincoln's understanding of the Declaration was global, and thus his idea of a new birth of freedom was global. And we're going to see an ideological influence that only comes about after the consolidation and after Lincoln's kind of ideological discourse of freedom as a global entity and not just something peculiar to the United States. What's important in this realm is that we have an extension of American exceptionalism. It's a major theme that diplomatic historians talk about, the idea that the United States was given a God-given mandate to spread freedom to the world, and that we're an exceptional or unique experiment where God ordained, right, we're the city on the hill. And this ties into this idea of new birth of freedom, because if Lincoln and Seward and the Union can overcome internal division at home and restore a new birth of freedom, why can't we do that abroad? Why is it only a matter of the continental United States, of a reunification of North and South, East and West? Why can't it be abroad? So I think that's an important ideological theme that we need to apply to the Middle East. And I'll go into why in a little bit. Politically, we have the United States able to engage the world at large as one. Before we had the United States are, now it's the United States is. We're a single entity. The Amnesty Proclamation of 1868 repatriated many Confederates back into the Union. Interestingly enough, Lee never received a pardon or became a full citizen again. He was never tried for his crimes, but it wasn't until the 1960s with a Senate resolution that Lee received his citizenship. You also have power consolidating in the form of the Republican Party. You have Republican dominance for the next 50 years. You have Republicans dominating all the southern governorships. So you have political consolidation at the expense of the Democratic Party in the South. It's kind of an irony. Economically, it's important. Walter McDougall, who's a diplomatic historian, argues that the defeat of the Confederacy removed the last impediment to the maturation of a continental superstate with a booming population, industry, agriculture, and trade. This is known as the Beard-Hacker thesis, that the Civil War spurred economic production, and it's contentious. So it's really not in my interest, and I'm not equipped to defend that thesis, but rather to say that with the conclusion of the Civil War, and this is universally agreed upon, that America was transformed from an agrarian, slave-based system to a booming industrial economy. Most importantly in this is the introduction of assembly line production. you have American exports that are now more lucrative and attractive because we can finish competitive exports at a quicker rate through assembly lines and industry. Another irony, kind of this early examples of the American, the military industrial complex, is that with the end of the Civil War, there's a huge drop-off for demand of military equipment. So we have assembly lines producing all these rifles and military equipment, but we no longer have any domestic market. So we have a new boost in an interest in trade abroad. And communications, we have the railroad and the telegraph. They allow us to expand westward under the mandate of manifest destiny 50 years before Frederick Jackson Turner and the frontier thesis, right? That comes about at the end of the 19th century. But even in 1865, we have the completion of the first transcontinental railroad, and we have people headed west. They can arrive in the West quicker than before. They can communicate. So even before we have our frontier settled at home, we're looking abroad. And this is most important in the fact that in 1867, Seward buys Alaska from the Russians, kind of the first impulse or inkling of American empire in the Johnson administration, when Lincoln buys it from the Russians for 2 cents an acre. That's cheaper than what we got the Louisiana Purchase for. And finally, we tend to forget that we have American discovery of oil in 1863 in Pennsylvania. We have a new lucrative export in the form of kerosene. So we have all these economic incentives. We have a consolidation of economic power. Now we're ready to look overseas with our excess arms, our kerosene and petroleum products, as well as other finished goods. And now, I guess finally, kind of the crux of the paper is looking at how U.S. diplomatic relations with the Middle East fundamentally changed in light of this consolidation of power. Walter Zimmerman says that the record of American statecraft after the Civil War shows a persistent effort to increase influence and expand territory beyond the continental boundaries of the U.S. The U.S. is a perfect case study for this. Ideologically, we had missionaries beginning to settle and having influence, but in 1866 they found Syrian Protestant College under Dr. Daniel Bliss, who in the midst of this blazing civil war is able to get a grant from New York State to start a university and gets private philanthropy. He got a majority of his money from a relative of Eleanor Roosevelt that had these Christian ambitions and decided to fund this college. So in 1866 you have the Syrian Protestant College, which is now the most prominent educational institution in the Middle East, and it's the American University at Beirut. At a time when American universities barely got a dozen students because all these men were fighting the Civil War, Syrian Protestant College had a medical school open and had an opening class of a little over a dozen people educating native Arabs in American discourse, right? And so you have this new birth of freedom educationally.